The agenda this week checked in on the state of the Great Lakes, heard how women face a power gap in this country, spoke to former Liberal MP Celina Caesar-Chavannes about leaving politics, and assessed the level of political polarization in Canada as part of the TVO Toronto Star initiative, the Democracy Agenda. The agenda's week in review begins with why non-sports related concussions matter too.
What is it about concussions that we don't apparently seem to want to either recognize or acknowledge that we've sustained one?
Right. Well, I think a lot of that is to do with, you really want to carry on with what you're doing. You want to feel like you're okay. You want to feel like that you can do the activity for your day. I mean, I think with the stories of Calypso and Hugo, we can see that we have people who are very, very passionate about what they do and they want to continue that. And denial is something that does happen. And I think that's another reason why the awareness and the recognition is very important, so that as soon as something like that does occur, you can think, oh my goodness, that could have been a concussion, because I know what a concussion looks like and I know what that feels like or could feel like, and recognize it in yourself or recognize in someone around you when something like that does happen.
Well, keeping in mind that it's also a very individualized injury, so some of the symptoms that one individual might experience might not be the same as what somebody else might experience. There's a constellation of these types of symptoms that might occur.
But
Right.
also there are lots of other reasons why someone might not want to recognize a concussion or not want to report it. And there is a stigma around having a brain injury. And so that is another factor for sure.
And then in the workplace, there could be reprisals at work, pressure from others, or kind of feeling like they're weaker than other people, or having that sense from other people themselves. So these are all points that people take into consideration when not reporting.
Well, that's an interesting angle. Calypso, let me follow up with you on that. Has there at any point in your, I don't know if you call it this, your post-concussion journey, has there been any point at which you've thought to yourself, I have to deny this because I don't want to be, I don't know, denied promotions or thought of as less than strong by colleagues or my boss or anything like that? Has that been a part of it?
No, not at all. My boss at the time was wonderful, and she was very willing to adjust work for anyone who had an injury. So, for example, part of my job was driving a tractor, and because of the noise, I just felt like I couldn't do that for the next few weeks. So she was fine with that. It was more just the fact of having to miss work, and since my concussion didn't happen at work, not getting any compensation for that, and feeling like I did have this pressure to return to the workspace just so I would get paid again.
Gotcha. And Hugo, how about you? Was there any aspect of stigma associated with this that you worried about?
Yeah, I would say 2 to 3 parts. First, my family. I come from a very traditional family where I guess concussions aren't a thing. So my dad was like, why are you being lazy, staying in a room, lights off, just sleeping all the time? You should get work done. You're in your master's, get it done. So he didn't understand that because there's no physical symptoms, there's actually things going on in my head that I wasn't sure of. And then second part, I have friends who have had concussions, but obviously the duration varies person to person. So they're like, oh, it goes away within a week. Like you're still talking about it, you're being a sissy type thing. But luckily, again, my colleagues at the Faculty of Kinesiology were well aware and well versed in concussions. So they helped me kind of support and motivate me throughout the whole process.
So Hugo, this whole awareness thing, this is something we all need to work on. People are not being malingerers when they have head injuries, right?
Yeah.
Gotcha. Now, we heard from Calypso that she basically had to go lie on a couch, no lights, no noise for a week. And after that, she felt somewhat better and able to return to her regular duties. How about for you? What was your treatment?
So, yeah, same thing. Basically, no lights, no TV, no cell phone, lots of sleep. But I'm not gonna lie, I broke those rules. You can only do that for so long, and not want to turn on the news and check out the agenda on TVO. So, yeah, and they told me not to do any exercise to, try to maintain, try not aggravate the symptoms. But actually, it wasn't until I took part in a program called Prime at U of T, where I got to know Sandia better, that I realized the importance of actually doing exercise, although not at such a high intensity to aggravate your symptoms, and the importance of doing it within the early stages of the concussion to kind of help speed the recovery process up.
Well, watching the agenda, I guess, seems like a very reasonable exception to the rule of no television, no activities, or anything like that. But beyond that, I mean, Hugo, did you not know that every time you played a video game or turned on the news or something that you would be setting back your recovery?
You know, I thought it was worth it because for me, again, I was unaware of the whole concussion thing. So I was like, it won't hurt that much, or it's not going to be a lasting effect. And then like 2 days after, you know, everything just hits you like a wall.
Pick one problem related to the Great Lakes that you care deeply about and tell us how it could be solved.
Oh, well, one of the problems that I see with the Great Lakes is the whole issue of contaminants. One of the things that we see as a native people is that the scientists and the governments all stare at one contaminant at a time. And so they look, they say, oh, well, mercury, PCBs, dioxins, dibenzofurans, but they look only at one contaminant at a time. I'm afraid that the fish don't take one contaminant at a time, they take them all. And so to us, it's how can we look at the impact of these contaminants on human beings? Not just one, but all of them together. And this is an issue that I think will become greater as we go along, because the sciences are now having to deal with these type of questions in the environment. If we think the nuclear disposal is a tough question, think about how many contaminants we have in the environment, and really we have very little understanding about how they all work together, whether they compound each other or whether they work individually or synergistically. We really don't know. And yet we continue to put them into the environment.
Mike, one big problem that you'd love to see solved and how you'd solve it.
Well, I'm a little biased here because a lot of the research that I conduct here at the Great Lakes Institute for Environmental Research relates to the harmful algal blooms in Western Lake Erie and Lake St. Clair. And this is an issue that I think we know how to solve it. It just requires will. This is an issue that as I mentioned earlier, takes into account actions in our watershed and the resulting implications within the lake. Agricultural activity far and away is behind the algal blooms we see in Western Lake Erie, Lake St. Clair. And so try to identify solutions to mitigate these blooms. And we know they're going to be expensive. We're looking at if left unchecked, and a recent study by scientists at Environment Canada showed that if left unchecked, we'd be looking at $270 million per year in costs incurred just in the Canadian portion of Lake Erie due to losses in tourism, treatment of drinking water, ecosystem services, etc.
Let me save the last 30 seconds for Molly. A problem that you'd like to see solved and how you'd solve it.
Well, we talked a bit about aquatic invasive species earlier, and Asian carp are a fish that are getting a lot of attention in the United States and in Canada. And recently, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the state of Illinois and Michigan have all of the agreements and funding in place to move to the next phase of a project that's designed to keep Asian carp out of Lake Michigan and out of the Great Lakes. So they've designed an Asian carp gauntlet that includes a number of technologies. And if we can get those technologies put into place, we hope that we can keep Asian carp out of the Great Lakes forever.
I think you've probably heard the statistic that women make 87 cents for every dollar that a man makes. But that's the overall hourly average of all women compared to all men. And I think what I wanted to know and what my colleagues wanted to know was, are men and women in the exact same job making the same money? Like, is that actually, like, does that pay gap exist? And that's where the project started, and it went much further than that.
It sure did, and here's how you describe it in the pages of the Globe and Mail. What is the power gap? Here we go, Sheldon. When people talk about the glass ceiling, it usually refers to women breaking through to the C-suite or president's office. But the Globe's analysis has found that women seem to be topping out as mid-level managers. In truth, the ceiling metaphor isn't a great one because the numbers don't show a hard barrier women can't cross. It's more of a leaky pipeline. In many workplaces, especially universities, the leak visibly accelerates a few rungs up from the bottom. What is clear is that by the highest salary band, women are dramatically outnumbered. What does this mid-level management situation look like in practical terms? Like, where are women actually getting stuck here?
So this is, I think, the big takeaway from our investigation. As I said, we were very narrowly focused on wages to start. But when we started getting the data back, what we found was wages were a problem, but the bigger issue was just the lack of women. There were so many more men by almost every measure. And one of the ways that we looked at this issue was we divided up the hundreds of different organizations, institutions, entities in our data set into salary bands to see the distribution, the gender divide at different salary levels. And what was just clear as day is that there were lots of women in the lower salary bands, but at the very top, there were very few women. And that gap started to accelerate about halfway to the top. So what was really interesting is this idea of the glass ceiling, like what in that paragraph it said is, I think we so often think about the glass ceiling as being in the president's office, but women are hitting that glass ceiling as mid-level managers. You can see their numbers just start to sharply decline. And it isn't, an actual just like a level that they don't pass. It is slow, but what's clear is that by the end, they're gone.
Do you know why it happens?
Well, this is the subject of recent stories and what's going to be the subject of the rest of our series over the course of the year. I guess there's two things that we've really highlighted so far. One is there's a large body of research that looks at the cultural, sociological barriers that women encounter. This is the stuff that you've probably heard about. There's women are penalized for exhibiting traits that are revered in men, traits that happen to be associated with leadership, things like ambition, confidence. Women pay more of a price for having children than men do. Women are penalized for success. They're viewed more negatively. So there's all of those kind of stereotypes and biases that are working against women. But the other side of it, which was the subject of a story we published last week that I think is just really important, is the laws in this country that prevent gender discrimination have been on the books for decades. You couldn't add a single one that would make things better. The experts that I'm talking to say the problem is they aren't being enforced. It's very difficult if you are the victim of gender discrimination to find any recourse. And that's for a variety of reasons that we get into in the piece.
During your first meeting with Prime Minister Trudeau, you were his former parliamentary secretary. This is after he made you the parliamentary secretary. He asked you if you trusted his judgment. What did you tell him?
No.
What was his reaction?
Well, I noticed the tension sort of go up in the room. And you have to understand that, as parliamentary secretary, I'm thinking this person wants me to be honest. And I've been married. At that time, I was married to my husband for over 15 years. There are some times that I don't trust his judgment. And the fact that the prime minister is asking me this question, and I'd only known him for a very short period of time, I wanted him to know that I'm going to challenge him sometimes. I'm going to challenge his views, his policy, his perspectives, because I don't necessarily trust his judgment. I don't know him.
What was his reaction to you when you said, I think what you said was, no?
I was like, nah, like, really? So the tension in the room, I felt that tension in the room kind of rise a little bit. And the subsequent question was, why not? And I had heard from other individuals, liberals or other people in media and otherwise, talking about how the ministers who were put in cabinet had helped him on his leadership campaign or helped during the election. And I said, well, because of that reason, that's why I don't trust your judgment. It's too transparent. You should have been a little bit more clear about who you were putting in cabinet and not so transparent around, putting the people that helped you. Like it looks like nepotism. And I don't really think that they appreciated that sort of straight talk, these are the facts kind of person.
You would send emails to the Prime Minister's office. How often were your emails responded to?
That maybe once or twice. It was interesting because as parliamentary secretary to the prime minister, I really wanted to ensure that I was supplementing any of the work that I was doing to his agenda to make sure that I was filling in the gaps, that I was not just sort of being like this figurehead of a person, but actually working to help remove
You
some
say
of this
token,
workload.
right? You felt like a token?
Yes. Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And these are one of the things that I said right from the beginning. So before he asked me that question about trusting his judgment, I walked in and I said, I do not want to be. I hope that I wasn't chosen for your as your parliamentary secretary to fill any racial or gender gaps that you have in your cabinet. I'm perfectly happy being the member of parliament for Whitby. And I was very clear that I didn't want to be tokenized. I'm highly educated. I ran a successful business. I could be strategic and I could help fill gaps in the work that he's doing. And that's what I expected the role to do. It turned out that it was not that role at all.
You even sent an email saying you're resigning, but I'll let people read the book to find out what happened. I think it felt like you were getting frustrated, even sometimes maybe angry with the lack of communication, and that the PM wasn't delegating work to you or having you attend events on his behalf. But some could say that, a risk-averse PMO might not trust an MP to represent them who flat out said she didn't trust the Prime Minister's judgment. What do you say to them?
Well, I say to them that what would you expect someone to say? Would you want them to just be the person that says yes to every single thing that you put forward? Or do you want somebody to challenge you? Again, this is not, the local barista, the barista at our local coffee shop. I mean, all respect due to baristas. This is the leader of a G7 country who, in my opinion, you would want someone who's going to challenge you. You'd want someone who's not going to say yes to you all the time. You'd want someone who's going to provide that dissent and that strategy and that difference of opinion. But if that conversation did happen where it was, if they don't trust if she doesn't trust my judgment, we don't want her, then I think some of that fallout we saw with the government towards the end, especially around SNC and some of the other scandals that have come to fruition.
The polarization we see in Canada is about identity and values issues. I think that just about before the pandemic, if anybody can remember before the pandemic, we were in the middle of a very large national conversation about the blockades taking place across the country, Indigenous protests. And that was starting to be very, very fiercely partisan and very polarizing. And I think, there's been a suspension of it for a bit during the pandemic, but I think when we talk about values and identity in Canada, I think we do get into polarizing forces. Not as bad as the States, but not undisturbing either.
It's interesting how that issue has not gone away, but the coverage of it utterly has. Don't you think?
True.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Andrew, let me get you to follow up. Do you see signs of a deepening polarization due to rising or surging populist anger in Canada?
I do, but I think one of the problems that Canadians have in recognizing it is that we're too focused on the American version of it, and I think in a lot of things we spend too much time comparing ourselves to the Americans and patting ourselves on the back about the Americans, because one of the interesting things about Canadian populism and Canadian regionalism, as I think I understand it, is that it manifests itself. The populism and polarization manifests itself as regionalism, not as anti-immigrant, trends or even any sort of pining for an authentic, national identity that never existed for various reasons. But I do think that Canada is a highly regional country, and a lot of those polarizing and populist excesses or impulses just manifest themselves as just an alienation from the center and from one another. I wrote a column in the Globe and Mail about a year and a half ago that talked about a poll that ECOS did, I think, about 2 years ago that no one really paid a lot of attention to, but kind of showed that Canadians don't really like one another that much. And to the extent to which they do, it's Albertans and Saskatchewanians having a bit of a bromance, the Maritimes kind of like one another. But apart from that, everyone kind of just doesn't like one another. And I think that's the way these impulses manifest themselves in Canada, as sort of a mutual indifference and alienation, which is, in a lot of ways, as problematic as anything going on in the United States.
Well, can I say for the record, I like you. In fact, I like everybody who's on this program tonight. So that's a good start, anyway, for continuing our discussion. And in fact, maybe this is a good time to get out of central Canada and let's go east to the Maritimes. Vicki, you used to live in Toronto. Now you're in New Brunswick. Do you sense or do you regard this kind of political polarization differently now that you're in Atlantic Canada?
No, not fundamentally. I've lived in, I think, four provinces in this country. And, universally, what I find is that despite people not liking each other, most Canadians are nice. They're invested in the concept of being nice and being kind to one another. They might have political disagreements, but where that starts to deviate and where, what Susan's talking about, it comes to identity and values and that conversation we were having about Indigenous rights versus, the rights of certain companies or processes that people feel were sort of justifiable, that's where the rubber starts to hit the road and kindness starts to fall apart. And that is where I think the conversations about people being in the center doesn't necessarily hold as much value. I think these are differences. I don't know that there's inherently a lot of value in liking one another when these are differences about what is right and justice for your community versus what is desirable for an economy. I don't think we have to like each other about one of those things. The question is whether it's starting to seep in a much more toxic way that people aren't able to necessarily go to a barbecue with one another, or they can't walk past one another without feeling that their clothing or, a hat someone's wearing signifies, or requires an action or a political conversation that is much more toxic. I still think that, the middle or the center isn't as valuable as it once was. And I think that's because these issues are much more trenchant. And that's because Canadians value a lot of these things deeply.
Jen, I don't know if this is a fair observation, but I suspect it is a truism that when people in central Canada think of rising populist fury in the country, they probably think of Alberta first. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, I think it is fair. I wrote a column for Walrus a little while ago trying to explain Alberta to the rest of Canada, which is a perennial trope for any writer from Alberta. But one of the observations I made is that I don't think that Alberta is conservative as much as it is populist. And this, if you kind of see populism as the frame for Alberta politics, things like the rise of the NDP in 2015 make a lot more sense than if you assume that Alberta is just sort of reflexively conservative. Populism is a word that has a lot of different meanings, though. One of the ways that you framed this question earlier, is populism responsible for polarization? I think that puts the cart before the horse. I think that populism is a reflection of polarization, and I don't think that populism is a necessarily right-wing conservative or left-wing phenomenon. Populism just means that it's more of a grassroots phenomenon, a reaction against the perceived corruption of elite or oligarchic class. Like it's not, we are when we think of populism now in 2021, we often think of Donald Trump and the rise of the MAGA hats and that kind of a framework. But that's traditionally not really what populism was all about. And I'm not sure and that's certainly not reflected in the kind of populism that I see on the rise in Alberta.
No, that's a great point.
There's a little bit of that, certainly.
Yeah, that's a great point, because I well remember in, 2 election campaigns ago in the States, people saying the populism of Bernie Sanders might have been more challenging for Donald Trump than whatever Hillary Clinton had on offer. But Jen, follow up with this if you would. You write about Alberta's fossil fuel-based economy, and, you get a lot of very interesting feedback when you write about that kind of stuff. Can you give us some examples of the kind of stuff that your columns tend to provoke?
Oh, this is interesting because when I write about Alberta to the rest of Canada, I get to play the part of the arch conservative, defending the homeland. And yet when I write about Alberta to other Albertans, I get put into like the category of the raging leftist, right? Like, so it's just always fascinating to me to see the feedback.
That's just some of what we covered this week on The Agenda. For more, including the full conversations, you can visit our website, tvo.org, our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, or our Twitter feed, twitter.com/theagenda.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.